is actually the report's title explains that this is about dealing with employment issues following crisis. And it has been motivated by the numerous crises that have regularly afflicted the countries in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and was finalized during the depths of this most recent and severe economic and social shock, the COVID pandemic. So we have a report that is both timely and valuable as it focuses on the effects of crisis on workers and firms, and suggests policy responses that can bolster long-term and inclusive economic growth. We learned from the report that crises lead to persistent employment losses and reduction in formal job creation, permanent scarring of some workers, especially the low-skilled, and downturns that take longer to reverse in the region due to the less competitive market structure in many of the countries in Latin America. The report also offers insights that can serve well policymakers in Latin America, but also in other regions around the world. It calls for a three-pronged response strategy to crisis, underscoring the importance first of macroeconomic stability, including automatic stabilizers such as employment insurance and short-term compensation programs. Second, it underscores the importance of programs that complement income support with re-employment assistance and reskilling opportunities. And finally, a structural reform agenda that shouldn't be forgotten while dealing with short-run problems that addresses product market competition issues, creating an environment for good jobs and good firms, the so-called good jobs, good firm agenda. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn to the lead author of the study, Joanna Silver, who is a colleague of mine and who will present the report. Joanna's presentation will be followed by comments from two very distinguished discussants. We have with us today Professor Raquel Fernandez and Professor Rafael Dix Carneiro. Raquel is a professor in the Department of Economics at New York University. She's also the president of LACEA and a member of the Center for the Study of Equality, Social Organization and Performance at the University of Oslo, NBER, and many other organizations. She has previously been a tenured professor at the London School of Economics and Boston University, and has held various visiting positions at institutions such as University of Chicago, the Paris School of Economics, the World Bank, the Federal Reserve Board, and the IMF. She has also served as co-editor of the Journal of International Economics and as an advisor to the World Bank's World Development Report on Gender Equality and Development. Her most recent research is primarily in the areas of culture and economics, development and gender issues, sovereign debt, and political economy issues. Professor Rafael Dix Carneiro teaches at Duke University. He is an editor at Economia, the journal of LACEA, an associate editor at Quantitative Economics, and a research associate at NBER. His research covers topics related to international trade, labor economics, and development economics, especially the labor market adjustment process in response to trade shocks, which is very close to actually the topics looked at in the report that we are going to talk about today, but also labor market informality, migration, and crime. So it was a pleasure to introduce the discussants, and Joanna, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you very much, Raquel and Rafael. I'm so happy to be here and that you guys accepted this invitation. Thank you very, very much. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. you guys see the picture. So employment, employment in crisis, the path to better jobs in post-COVID Latin America. So I'm representing a larger team composed by Liliana de Souza, Truman Packard, and Ray Robertson. So what we do in this report, we look at three main things. First, how economies in Latin America adjust to crisis and economic shocks, how how crisis changed the labor market flows and its structure. The second is more like micro, is whether they have differential impacts across workers, across firms, and across places. And then a final part, which is kind of reflecting on the policy responses that could be put in place to vis-a-vis what we discussed in these two previous chapters. So what were the adjustment dynamics that we detected when we look at the data for Latin America? So using quarterly data for the countries when we had a long enough series, we found that when it comes to recovery of employment, things are a bit different from the recovery of output of GDP. When we see here, we mark three different crises: the debt crisis in Brazil, the global financial crisis in Mexico, and the Asian financial crisis in Chile. And we map in the dotted line the long-term trend of employment before the crisis. And as you can see, the actual trend of the actual series of the employment post-crisis really gets far away from the trend and never recovers that trend. So it's not just a matter of levels, it's recovering the initial pre-crisis level, but whether it gets to the trend, it doesn't. So that's why that's why I would say here that when it comes to employment, recovery is often a myth when we look at crisis in Latin America. And when we look at the effects that crisis had on the structure of labor markets, the conclusions were quite interesting, and I'll explain methodologically in the next slide how we did this. But basically, considering data from Brazil, Chile, and Mexico, from social security records and national accounts, what we find is that each recession in Latin America leads to a lasting contraction of formal employment of about 3%. And this represents a net loss of about 1.5 million jobs. So even 3 years later, after the crisis, the average crisis in Latin America, we see that the formal sector is smaller. And the recovery, which is marked here in terms of all happens, is led through the informal sector that expands by about 2%, compared to a non-recession scenario. So at each recession, the region ends up with less and worse jobs over time. So here is more like how we did this country by country. So what we did was we had administrative data from social security records for Brazil, Chile, and Mexico for this period that we see in the slide. And we knew the hiring and firing dates for each worker, so we could multiply the data. That's what we did. And that way we had a series, a long series of formal employment monthly. We also had monthly statistics from the national accounts of total employment. So that's how we could do impulse response functions following Jordan and Jordan told 2020, where we computed first business cycles using quarterly GDP, and then we identified with a recession time is the time when that were in recession, and then considering all the recessions that happened in these long periods of time, we come up with this conclusion that I just draw in the previous graph. And as you can see, whereas you see here, Brazil is really the case where you have total employment falling, formal employment falling the durable way, and all the recover through informal employment. In Chile, you have some recover from formal employment that is faster, whereas in Mexico, you see, like in Brazil, formal employment contraction in a very durable way, and all the reaction being from informal employment, but with a lag, just starting at about 20 months after each recession. Then we looked at the labor force surveys and transitions across states in the labor force surveys. Here, our idea was, okay, in the previous graphs, we showed that informal were playing a big role in the recovery, but we didn't see what happened to unemployment. So when here we look at the cyclical components of GDP and unemployment rate, we see that despite the high informality, unemployment is a very important part of the adjustment. And then what we also found very interesting, going back again to the administrative data, was that when it comes to recovery, what was really an important factor behind the low speed of recovery was the low strength of job creation. So the economies had a problem of job destruction during the crisis, but also had a problem of slow job creation in the post-crisis, and that was the reason why these effects were so lasting. So now turning to this differential impact. So first of all, we using the closing, which is kind of the most extreme effect of crisis, plants closing in Mexico, and a survey that had retroactive information about workers. What we found was that, you know, it takes about 10 years for a worker who is displaced after firm closure to recover his wages. This period is significantly different if the worker voluntarily quits, in which case he recovers in about 3 years, or when the worker chooses to close his own business. In this case, the recovery period is about 4 years. And what we see as well is that entering, and this we knew from the literature, entering the labor markets in a bad time is a bad luck that lasts about a decade. And also in luck this happens, but this happens more, not so much because wages are forever worse, but more because the workers tend to have a longer period of unemployment and higher periods also in informality. Then we turn to a worker level adjustment in the formal labor markets and kind of for global financial crisis, foreign shocks more generally, to see in this more detailed setting what were really the effects. And we contrasted to countries that were kind of very different institutionally, and as you see, will adjust very differently. We looked at data on formal employment for Brazil and Ecuador using the Social Security records. And what we find is that in both countries, the global financial crisis led to lasting effects on employment. But whereas Ecuador never recovers, with time, the Brazilian average month's work approaches zero. Here we have the effect of the shock at the firm level, and then we are mapping the coefficient of the shock on these outcomes that we plot here. So average month's work, average wages for each of the countries. And as you can see, a big difference between these two countries was on how wages adjust. So whereas in Brazil, wages fell and fell in a durable way, in Ecuador, the effect on wages was not statistically significant and was small. So overall, in terms of magnitude, the global financial crisis foreign shocks, in considering the period that we had from in the post-crisis period, so 2009, 2017, they led to a fall of about 2.7% in the months worked in Brazil, and about 7%, so much larger, in Ecuador, where wages did not adjust. The fall in wages was about 6% for a 10 percentage point worse global financial crisis shock. So then we looked across workers with different types of skills using this data. And what we find is that overall, the effects on skilled workers are not statistically significant. All the effects are concentrated in the unskilled workers when we take the whole period. And this happens because, as you can see here in the graph, here we are plotting the dynamic effects for workers with higher education and without higher education. And after 2 years, the effects for the workers with higher education stop being significant. And all the adjustment is by workers without higher education, for whom they take up to 10 years to recover. And the recovery is very small. Then we turn to the firm channels. So we had linked data between firms and workers, and we wanted to know what were the firm channels underlying these adjustments that we saw at the worker level. And what we found was that when we looked at the selection, we see effects on selection, on exit in Brazilian firms. Brazilian firms do exit in response to the crisis, whereas in Ecuador, you don't see this margin of adjustment at all. What you see in both countries is a falling revenue, a downsizing in employment of firms, and also of productivity. But you also see that they adjust differently within firms in terms of their occupational restructuring. So in Brazil, this restructuring of firms really at the core has this occupational change, the change in the composition of their workforce. Firms in Brazil become more skill intensive because of the crisis. They decrease the quantity that they use of both skilled and unskilled workers, but they decrease more the quantity of unskilled workers than skilled workers. And in much of the scarring in Brazil, in fact, work happens for continuing workers and happens through less hours work for these workers and a higher likelihood of not renewing their fixed term contracts when the time arrives. In Ecuador, it's very different. So they don't exit the firms, they don't adjust their occupational structure, but they adjust production in the sense that they adjust away from capital. They decrease the quantity that they use of both capital and labor, but more so of capital. So they replace capital by labor. Another interesting part of the analysis was really looking at characteristics of the local labor markets and of sectors. So what we looked at, to be more concrete, was whether the level of market concentration and being, for example, a state-owned firm, which is kind of a protected firm in that sense, or in a sector where the market share is very concentrated in few firms, whether that would leave workers of the firms more impacted from the shock to have less severe effects. And actually what we see is that when you work at the state-owned firm, or when you work in a firm that belongs to a sector that is highly concentrated, you even have an increase in employment with the global financial crisis. It's as if a total reversal of the usual mechanisms of adjustment when you are protected by this type of lack of competition. Then we looked at more and less informal labor markets. And what we find is that more informal labor markets, workers in more informal labor markets in municipalities with higher informality, they suffer less. So here, two aspects, lower competition and more informality, as being aspects that protect workers, that in the sense that they don't suffer as much adjustment, but might lead to less long-term growth. So what can we do in terms of policies? So here, when we discuss policies, we divide the discussion in three parts. One, at the aggregate level, more kind of saying the idea would be to prevent crisis, or when you have a crisis, to kind of smooth the crisis to automatic stabilizers. And I'm going to develop more on that. The second part has to do with, so if there are all these labor scarring effects, then, we need to think about social protection and labor systems that really cautions workers, especially the unskilled, so we don't see these strong and long-lasting effects. And finally, because we saw that the structural part, these aspects of lack of competition, of informality, are so important, these characteristics of places are so important, a role for more structural policies. So here, in terms of macroeconomic terms, so we kind of are arguing for a prudent macro framework to avoid crisis, but some crises, even if when you try to avoid them, will happen. And in that sense, it's important to have the fiscal space to put in place more policies that then, smooth this employment fall. And to have that fiscal space, it's important to think about this with a longer term perspective, including tax policies, energy subsidies, the efficiency of spending, etc. But it's also important, this aspect of the automatic stabilizers, and the usual automatic stabilizer in OECD countries is the unemployment insurance. But there are others, these short-term compensation programs that can be kind of included in the economies in an automatic way when GDP or unemployment reaches a certain point, and that are easily adaptable. When it comes to unemployment insurance, what we saw was that only 1/3 of the countries in Latin America have unemployment insurance. So this type of automatic stabilizer is not in place in most countries, and this is something to reflect upon on either in the sense how to create or reform the unemployment insurance when it exists, but also on alternatives such as the one that I was alluding to. An important thing that we also looked was kind of, in the countries that do have unemployment insurance, is it the case that they are kind of being counter-cyclical, that they are increasing in crisis and decreasing in the other periods? And what we saw, and here I showed the examples of Brazil and Uruguay, was not really. So they were very disconnected from the GDP trends. So this is something that calls for not just think about what we don't have, but also think about reforms to the existing social unemployment insurance system. In terms of this cautioning of the impact on workers that we saw to be very strong and very lasting, it's very important to think about social assistance programs, unemployment insurance that we just spoke, but also, not thinking about these programs in a separate mode, but rather linked to the labor policies in the sense of enhancing worker skills so they can go to other jobs. Because we usually think about persistent effects when we think about technological change and other more structural aspects of the economy. But what we see is that also crises lead to these persistent changes, and in this sense, to the need of this reskilling sometimes. And when it comes to reskilling, it's very important to think that, the results are mixed, and sometimes these programs, even have difficulty in passing, in some cases, the cost-benefit analysis. Is not always the case. Some do work, but it's not guaranteed. So it's very important to kind of think these programs through, evaluate them very well, and adjust them as they are implemented. Three things that we do know about these programs is that they work best when they are aimed at the needs of local employers, when their curricula are designed in cooperation with them, when they follow students after they are employed to see if they get a job, if that job is in a related field, etc. And when they are offered not just by institutions disconnected with the community, but rather also community organizations, private agencies, or at least when these are included in the supply. So in this sense, all in all, what we are saying is really improvements in an employment insurance in the countries where these exist, to kind of avoid this disconnect between the business cycle and employment insurance spending. We are speaking about, improving not just training, but also job placement, referral mechanisms that have shown good results. We are speaking about, benefits for the informal workers that have to be very, very carefully thought, and also about active labor market policies, but being conscious of the evidence and trying to design them carefully and evaluate these programs. So finally, because much of this lack of job creation in the recoveries and even the adjustment when the crisis happen have to do with these more structural characteristics of the economy, we are kind of arguing that it's important to think about regional policy in the sense of local investments and infrastructural development to promote the local employment opportunities, competition policy to address this protectionism and unfair market conditions, and then labor regulations. Here in this graph, when you plot flexibility and protection, and you put the countries in Latin America and the world, you see that most countries in terms of labor legislation are in high flexibility and low protection, with some exceptions. But basically what there are is some kind of some aspects of the labor legislation in some countries that are still needing change, but is not a general situation. So each case here has to be considered. And when we are speaking about competition and regulation, we are speaking about, kind of understanding that opening on Saturdays, there is evidence for that for several countries. So opening different days or liberalizing, say here the example of Uber. There can be adjustments to be made, but there are also gains to be made in the quality and price of services provided. So, so here to end in this note that that crisis can change labor markets can change employment in a persistent way. These effects on informality seem to be very important and very prevailing. They change the structure of the economy. This is important to be considered. And when you come to workers, these effects seem to be persistent, very linked on different ways by which firms adjust. And then because of this setting, really the importance of thinking in the macro level, but also on the micro level about these policies that we discussed that go well beyond the usual labor policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. This was an excellent summary of your main findings, and you were very good keeping within the time slot that we had in mind for you. Now I will turn to Professor Raquel Fernandez for her comments. Followed, you will have, Professor Fernandez, you will have about 10 minutes. And then I'll turn to Professor Rafael Dix-Carneiro for his comments. And then we will have time also for some Q&A at the end of the session.
Okay, thank you very much, Elena, and thank you, Joanna, for an excellent presentation. I actually thought Rafael was going to go first, just alphabetically, and so I was going to give you kind of a general comments after his brilliant comments on trade and trade shocks and how that the labor market adjusts. But we're going to do it in the opposite way, which is fine. So this is a really excellent report. It's an important contribution to our knowledge of labor markets in Latin America and Caribbean. It uses new data sets. It has state-of-the-art empirical work, and it's a valuable source of much needed information and analysis. Now, the report, as you saw from Joanna's presentation, covers tremendous amounts of ground. It's the effects of crisis on employment, heterogeneous effects, how local markets and market structure matter, and policy suggestions. I'm mainly going to talk about crises and employment, and maybe ask a bit about what underlies the relationships that the authors find. So this was the figure that Joanna led with today, which is a great figure. And it shows you after 3 different crises for 3 different countries, how employment, in particular the log of the number of workers, changed as a result of the crisis or after the crisis. And what I want to show you here is, by way of comparison, the last 2 business cycles in the United States. And as you can see, the red line here is for men, the light blue line is for women. And am I sharing screen?
I'm sorry, Raquel, if you can share your screen, that will be great, because we see
Yes,
you, but we can't see your screen yet.
I am so sorry. I have been talking about, so I guess I was showing you this before, and now I'm showing you this, okay? And as you can see, sorry about that. There was no real recovery, neither in total amounts following these 2 crises. This is showing you not the log of employment as Joanna was doing, but rather simply employment to population ratio. There's no recovery, neither for men nor for women following these 2 crises, okay, or these 2 recessions, I should say, in the United States. So this seems to be something a bit general. And I would say that in order to understand it, one might want to ask, and I'm not going to have an answer, what the roles of basic things might be. And in particular, what the role of demographics, age, sex, and marital status. So let me start with changes in fertility. So in these countries, you've had very large changes in fertility, which is going to change the age structure and therefore change maybe the nature of employment. Here I just have for you to see Brazil. This is the total fertility rate in Brazil from 1950 to now. And as you can see, it's really fallen, okay? It's fallen from 6 kids in the 50s to about 4 kids in the 70s, to about 3-something kids in the 90s, and a little bit, under 2 kids by 2010. Okay, so very large changes in fertility. Now, why might that matter? Well, it's true that this is just a few years, so you may not expect a dramatic trend, but still it might take a long time to recover from a crisis. And because of that, the trend line that follows might look significantly different. Chile, which has seen less of an adjustment in total fertility rate, for example, you see less of an adjustment in the employment. It's not that big the change. Mexico actually saw very large changes in its total fertility rate, but this is now looking at 2003 rather than 1985. So from 2003 to 2017, it would not have been as large, which is might be a reason why Brazil looks rather different than Mexico. Now, I am not saying necessarily that it is fertility. I would like simply that the authors consider these demographic changes. Another important demographic change would be secular changes in female labor force participation, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. So here is a graph that comes from Fukui, Nakamura, and Steinson, which is a paper I discussed, which develops an idea that's also present in Albanese, which I'll talk about in 1 second. What this graph just shows you is how the US employment reacted N years before and after the recession. So 0 here is where the crisis starts or the recession starts in the United States. And as you can see, starting with the dark blue line, it recovers relatively quickly, say within 2 or 3 years. Same in the next one, 81, 82. Already in 1990, 91, it's not recovered till about 5 years later. And, when it comes to 2001, which was a short recession, it still had not recovered. And then we have the very deep recession of 2007 to 2009, the financial crisis. And as you can see, 5 years later, employment has not recovered. So, changing nature of recoveries seems to be something true in general. And that seems to have happened maybe after the last 2 crises, the last 3 recessions in the US. Now, if you look at this more closely, though, and you divide this up into men versus women, you notice an important difference between men and women. Actually, men have never really recovered very quickly. You can look at all these recessions, it's definitely the 2007, 2009 is the greatest one, but take the first one, 1973 to 1975, which in aggregate was relatively quick. You can see it took, 4 years later, 5 years later, men have not recovered. So what's underneath the quick recovery? Well, underneath the quick recovery was really what was happening to female labor force participation. Women, even though there was a recession going on in 1973 to 1975, they were actually increasing their labor force participation. It did not go down. Same for the 1981-82 crisis. And as you can see, as you go through different recessions, women start to look more and more like men because there isn't this amazing upward force in female labor force participation that is masking what's happening to men, okay? And that's really helping the labor market recover. But the composition in terms of genders of the labor market is changing. So one thing I would like to ask, therefore, is there something similar going on in the Latin American Caribbean region? Is there secular changes? Are there cultural changes going on in female labor force participation? The other thing that really might matter is marital status. So this is not necessarily something that we're used to thinking about that much, but I really think when I was discussing the paper, I really came to understand the Nakamura and Steinson and Fukui paper, really started to think hard about marital status. So here we have male employment over time, starting in 1970 to, the mid-teens, 2016, 2017. And here you have the well-known phenomena of female labor force participation increasing dramatically and then stabilizing. Underlying female labor force participation, and one thing I might as well point out right now, look what's happened to male participation in the market. It's really been falling over time in the US. So what's underlying the female labor force participation? Well, really most of that increase in women's labor force participation is coming from married women till 1990, which then stabilizes. A little bit is coming from separated, and by separated I include divorce, separated women, and a bit is coming from single women. But what matters is not necessarily how much each type increased their labor force participation, but also differences in levels. married women did and still do participate less than single or separated women. So if we have a change in the composition of the population, we're going to see changes in female labor force participation. And indeed, that is the case. So this is what's happened to the fraction in the population ages 25 to 54 of married women. In the United States, we saw a steady decrease in this fraction over this time. What's been increasing instead, it has to be the rest, it has to add up to 100%, is single and separated women. Those are the ones that just their composition has been changing. So if you now ask, what explains the change in female labor force participation from 1970 all the way to, the mid-teens in 2015? Well, really what explains it towards the end is the large increase in single women, given the fact that they work more. So the 28 percentage point increase in female labor force participation from 1970 to 2016 really came overwhelmingly from single women, from the fact that they work more and that we had a shift in them. I'm not saying this is what's going on in Latin America. I'm saying this is something that we need to look at. We need to understand the role of changing family structure, which is changing, I think, radically in Latin America, and how it contributes to the way employment reacts during a recession. I would have loved to have seen a longer time series when possible. Of course, I understand there's limitation of data. That's the only thing that really lets you understand how everything contributes. And one question I had throughout, and now I can see I've incorporated it in my own vocabulary. I talk about crises rather than recessions. In the US, we tend to talk about recessions. Do we need to distinguish between crisis and recession, or is in Latin America every recession a crisis, more or less? So that's one thing I felt I would have liked to have known more. And of course, since we want to know more, it would be nice to know the cause of these crises. Now, Joanna went over this picture in some detail, so I won't really talk about it much. But what I just wanted to emphasize here, and what I really liked about the paper, was how it went into talking about how the differences between the take-up of formal versus informal employment after a recession in these three countries. And for me, it would have been really interesting, I think, to try to understand more why in Chile this recovery in formal employment was so large, despite the increase, very large increase in the formal sector, in the informal sector. Whereas in the other countries, we see kind of similar increases, actually much smaller. In the informal sector, you do not see any recovery. Now, this is after 30 months. In the United States, these recessions, for men at least, last 4 or 5 years. So 30 months is 2.5 years. It may simply not be enough time. So even a longer time framework here would have been interesting to see. Another thing that Joanna, didn't get a chance to talk about as much when she did her heterogeneity was the inequality in unemployment risk, although she talked quite a bit about the scarring, which I think is a fascinating thing, and I'm sure Rafael will talk more about it. My first glance at this, which shows you over the 2005 to 2017 by deciles of wage earnings in countries, what's the risk of going into unemployment? I was struck by how equal Mexico was in its formal employment share, and say how unequal Argentina was. And I was kind of puzzled by this until I realized that, of course, Argentina has been generous with the world and has had many recessions in this time period. And what matters is, of course, if you're looking at a long time period like 2005 to 2017, is actually how often they've gone into recession, because you're getting an average here. So it's not necessarily true that Argentina is much more unequal than Mexico, although my guess might be that it would be. It's also that Argentina is much more crisis prone. And in the end, that is what matters to people. It's not, the inequality of a given crisis, but really also how often you go into crises. But I did find these interesting, and I would have loved to have seen it more broken out to understand a little bit more the contribution of frequency of crises or recessions vis-a-vis the inequality in unemployment risk across deciles. So I'm going to talk about this for 2 more minutes, and then I'm going to conclude. So I'm Giving you a contrast with the United States, because that's a country I know best. So I'm going to my own comparative advantage here. And what I'm giving you here is from 1967 to the year 2017. Let's look at this figure here. This is figures.com. This is only for men, prime age men, so think 25 to 54. And it's a paper from Heathcote, Perry, and Violante. And what's graphed here is they're right on top of each other, so you can't really see any difference, is for the top 85th to 95th percentile, their earnings and how many weeks worked. And as you can see through all these recessions, which are here in gray for the US, there's no change in which weeks worked for this top 85th to 95th percentiles, and their earnings in terms of and wages have just gone up over time. And we're all kind of familiar with this figure. Here is the middle. This is the top 45th to 55th percentiles. And as you can see, there's a little bit more movement in weeks worked, but it barely budges. Okay, basically no changes throughout the recessions. There is more changes in wages, and here you can see the appalling state of affairs in the United States, where there's not really been much gains, between 1967 and 2017 in terms of, the earnings and the wages that these individuals make by decile. Lastly, and including very importantly the zeros, let's look at the bottom 0 to 20th percentile. And that's really where an amazing amount of action is in the United States. First of all, here you have what's happening to wages. And as you can see, it's never really recovered. It goes up and down. I mean, it goes down with recessions, recovers a bit, then goes down again, et cetera. But up to now, it has not fully recovered. What is amazing is the secular fall in weeks worked, which has been decreasing with every recession. And of course, thinking about these, by the way, I should have said these are weekly wages. Putting wages and weeks work combined, the large decrease in earnings over time. Now, if you ask yourself where this is coming from, and that's will be the last figure I'll show you. If you ask yourself where this is coming from, the gray line is showing you weeks work conditional on working. So throwing out the people who do not work at all, 0 weeks. And this, as you can see, it actually does not look that different. What's the fraction who's been working, the fraction working? You can see that that is falling dramatically over time. So conditional on working, weeks fell from 43 to 38. The fraction, the bottom 20 percentile that works, went from 88% to 37%. That is huge, huge. So throwing out zeros, if you want to understand inequality, if you want to understand what's happening to employment, and this is, again, I'll emphasize, only for prime age males, that's a huge part of it. And again, I don't know what's happening in Latin America. I wouldn't know how to explain this. Some people say disability, some people say, it's retirement, some people, there's a lot of explanations for it. But I'd be very interested again to see some sort of decomposition that includes the zeros for Latin America. So let me just end with what I would like to see more on, which is just a list of desiderata, but we might as well go through it. One is the role of market power. Joana has done incredible work using Brazilian micro-level data, and what they show is that highly concentrated sectors, what they do is they actually expand on employment after a global financial crisis, whereas low concentration sectors contracted employment. So Joana mentioned this briefly. It'd be nicer to understand the overall employment effects and if it's true for other countries and how this might depend also on the sectors aside from the concentration. There's interesting work that Marcela Melendez and Marcela Slava have done on firm size distribution. And one of the things that comes out of that is, there's the share of income that goes to labor is actually remarkably low. It's on average 40%, let's say, compared to say about 60-something% in the United States or in Europe, which has been going down both in the United States and Europe as well. What's the relationship between this and market concentration? Can we think about that? Since, this is just a nice laundry list, what's the relationship between firm size, distribution, sectoral composition, and TFP? overall, I thought that it would be useful to maybe have comparisons which benchmarks, not benchmarks because they're representative, but just to help us understand what's different about Latin America and what's not so different. Now, Joanna incorporates, definite all the state of the art in terms of analysis and in terms of references, but I still think it would be nicer to have a longer time series and show us for a few countries what's going on. I also would urge the authors to just have a little bit more quantitative information about changes in employment over time, without too much analysis necessarily, because this, I think, would help us think about the role of changes of demographics that I've talked to you about, formal and informal in sectors, which Joanna spends quite a bit of time on in the analysis, but far less so on manufacturing versus services versus agriculture and how the sectoral compositions might be changing, or education and how that might change. Thanks. In conclusion, let me say that this is really an excellent and extremely useful contribution, and love to see more of it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Raquel. This was very interesting, informative, and certainly something to think about as directions for future work for Joanna and her team. Now let's turn to, I think, Joanna, you would prefer to respond after the discussion comments, right? So we can go to the next discussion. Rafael, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, sorry. I didn't know how to turn my mic on once I was sharing my screen for some reason. Right, well, thank you very much, Joanna, and for the invitation, and everyone for being here. Let me start saying this is a great, awesome report. I mean, it uses rich microdata and admin data across many countries to document how labor markets adjust to negative shocks. It provides very rich evidence on the various margins of adjustment, as well as on the horizon through which these adjustments occur. And I'm very sure that this report will be a very key reference for Latin American for years to come. There's a typo there. Now, I'd like to put some of these results into context here, and thinking about these results from the perspective of my own work on the effect of trade on labor markets. And let me start saying that the results are broadly consistent with findings from my own work on trade and labor markets. However, I think there's a bit of a puzzle, and I will elaborate on it later. So for now, let me just talk about some of the similarities here. Okay, so I have done work with Brian Kovac on how Brazil has responded to the 1990s trade liberalization episode. And what we do in this 2019 paper is that we look at how different regions of the country, so we can think about different regions of the country producing different goods, different regions are differentially exposed to import competition arising from liberalization. Okay, so you can think about regions that are very exposed and regions that are not very exposed to import competition. And if we compare the evolution of employment in these two types of regions that are very exposed and regions that are not very exposed, what we see is that regions that are very exposed to import competition go through periods of increases in non-employment. So unemployment increases in response to this decline in labor demand caused by import competition. And what we see also, in the medium run, is that we see this increase in unemployment and moderate increases in informal employment. Now, in the long run, though, something different happens. We see a recovery in unemployment in these regions, but at the expense of large increases in informal employment. And that led Brian Kovac and I to hypothesize that the informal sector acted as a buffer to trade displaced workers in this situation in in a manner similar to what Joanna has documented in her report. Okay. So I think that the findings in this report are broadly consistent with these facts. So what I'm going to be doing next is actually discussing some of my recent research, trying to understand this informal sector as a buffer to trade displaced workers. Okay, but we're going to be doing this in the context of not really a trade shock, but rather as a recession shock. Okay, so just to put some context here, we have a quantitative framework here to think about, you know, the informal sector and whether the informal sector worked as a buffer in response to recessions. Okay, and broadly here, just to put things into context, the framework has the following ingredients. Okay, so first we're going to have heterogeneous firms in productivity that choose to operate in the informal sector. But if they choose to operate in the informal sector, there are several costs associated with the informal sector, right? So the firm bypasses regulations and tax, but there's a cost associated to, you know, more expensive credit or opportunity costs of being formal, or even there's a probability of being caught and you have to pay fines. Okay, but these firms can also choose to be in the formal sector. But in which case, if a firm chooses to be in the formal sector, the firm is going to be subject to all taxes and regulations. Okay? The model has social matching frictions, so we're going to have unemployment in this framework. And we have a very rich institutional setting. So the government imposes minimum wages, firing costs, payroll and value-added taxes, as well as import tariffs. And what is key here and what generates informality in this framework is the fact that taxes and labor market regulations are not perfectly enforced by the government. Okay, and that is going to be giving rise to some firms to choose to be informal, basically. Okay. Okay, so that said, here are some of the quantitative findings from this framework, and I think it speaks to some of the findings that Joanna spoke about. Okay, so here we're thinking about, okay, so what do we take this economy and we hit this economy with a recession? Okay, so what if we reduce aggregate productivity in this economy? Okay, so what if there's a negative labor demand shock in this economy? Okay, and we're going to be doing this under three different scenarios. One is the benchmark economy. This is the economy to which we estimated the model. Then there's going to be another scenario here, which is one scenario where the government is actually cracking down on informality. So it's increasing enforcement. So it's reducing formalities through higher enforcement. And there's a third possibility where the government is able to completely ban informality. Right, it's a fairy tale scenario, but it's still useful to think about it. So we're going to be hitting the economy with a recession shock under these three different scenarios. Now, if you look at the first figure here, what we see is that if we hit the economy with a recession, okay, if we think about the benchmark economy, we see a large increase in informal employment. Okay, but you don't see necessarily an increase in unemployment. Okay, however, if we hit the economy with a recession and the government is really cracking down on informality, we don't see much of an increase in informality, but we see a large increase in unemployment. Okay, and specifically, if the government is perfectly cracking down on informality, then of course there's no effect on informal employment, but there's a very large increase in the unemployment rate. So these two figures are very consistent with the evidence that Brian Kovac and I presented for Brazil, which is that if you present the economy with a negative labor demand shock, the existence of the informal sector does work as an unemployment buffer. Right, so some of these displaced workers find eventually employment in the informal sector, and that prevents them to be unemployed. Okay. Now, the fact then that we have this reallocation of resources to the informal sector also presents us with the possibility that, well, the economy now is going to be very badly misallocated. I mean, that's a possibility. right? So the government, by allowing an informal sector to flourish, the government is essentially treating small unproductive firms more favorably than large and productive firms. So if at the onset of a negative shock, the informal sector increases, potentially, I mean, this could be positive for some of the workers that eventually find reemployment, but that could be pretty bad for the economy as a whole because it becomes even more misallocated. Okay, and here what we see is precisely something that illustrates this point and also shows the value of having a quantitative framework in mind, which is that if we hit the economy with a negative shock, with a recession shock, under the benchmark, actually welfare goes down further than under the situation where the government is actually cracking down on informality somewhat. Okay, and what's happening here, if you look at this figure, is precisely this idea that if you're relocating resources to the informal sector, you are exacerbating misallocation in this economy. Right? So this idea that whenever we have recessions, we have a cleansing effect, right? So we have some of the least productive firms exiting the market, okay? But if we have a large informal sector, that may not be the case. You're just pushing some of the formal firms to be informal, but they're still existing, okay? And that leads to the fact that if we have a negative shock to the economy, aggregate TFP goes down a lot in the benchmark economy as these firms are actually going to the informal sector. But if you somewhat repress informality, okay, the decline in TFP is not as strong, okay? And this illustrates the fact that if you allow for this relocation to the informal sector, you may actually be leading to a very bad allocation of resources in the long run. Now, as I said in the beginning, I said, look, some of the findings that Joanna has in the report are broadly consistent with some of my findings with Brian Kovac, but there's a key difference here, and this is something I think we need to understand, right? So the effects that I documented with Brian Kovac are responses to permanent shocks. Brazil liberalizes trade, tariffs decline, but they decline sort of forever, right? So it's we have this negative shock that is to some firms and some workers that are permanent. But the findings in the report suggest persistent effects to temporary shocks, and here I'm sort of puzzled of why is that. And I think Raquel provided some mechanisms that I mean you guys could look into to sort of try to reconcile of why you have these very persistent effects to temporary shocks. Okay, and then finally, the very last slide here is talking a little bit about, I want to talk about active labor market policies, because I mean, this is a topic where we definitely need more work on what works and what does not, okay? So the first piece of evidence that comes to mind here is David McKenzie at the World Bank has a 2017 survey documenting the evidence for developing countries. And his conclusion is that in the evidence that he's surveying points towards the fact that active labor market policies don't tend to work much. And whenever they do, they typically don't pass a cost-benefit analysis. Okay? On the other hand, there's a very nice paper in the trade literature by Ben Hyman, who is at the New York Fed, showing that the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program in the U.S. helped tremendously workers who took it up. Okay, so in the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program here is working through providing some of these workers with retraining. Okay, and it really helped some of these trade displaced workers recovering earnings and employability over the following 10 years after the loss of their job. But the other thing as well, and this is something we don't understand very much, which is that we don't really understand general effects of these active labor market policies, right? So, for instance, here this is a 2014 paper of mine that actually simulates a retraining program to compensate some of the losers of trade. And in one of the simulations that I do simulate the retraining program. And then what I do see in that specific simulation is that a bunch of the workers who lose their jobs because of import competition, they retrain and then bunch into one specific sector. And then you have this flood of workers into this one sector, really hurting people who are initially employed in this sector. Okay, so it's really important to be taking into account also these general equilibrium effects and the spillover effects of active labor market policies, which is something we don't really know about. Okay, so we definitely, let me just finish here that, I mean, this is definitely a point that Joana stresses, and I'd like to stress here, which is, I mean, we definitely need more evidence for the developing countries in particular on the effectiveness of active labor market policies. But overall, amazing report. So great job.
Thank you so much, Rafael. Thank you. Joana, we have to go to you immediately because we are running out of time. I thought we have a lot of time, but this discussion has been amazingly provocative, and I actually did not exercise my duties as well as I thought I will. I just got caught up in the presentations too much. So please, Joana, you can provide closing remarks. Probably we won't have time for questions.
So you know, I'll be brief. I really agree with all the comments, and I want to thank Raquel. I think what you say is true. With those graphs were like showing the root of the crisis, but there could be other structural aspects, other secular trends that happen at the same time and have the same breaking point. So I agree with you that we could look at these aspects. Changes in labor force participation, those that you mentioned, I think that that is an important point. The difference between Chile and the other countries, I think that would be great for future research. Those are very well taken points, and I think it's also true that in these impulse response functions, having a longer time horizon will be great. It's just this method of Jordan normally loses precision as we enlarge this period, but definitely it makes perfect sense. And actually, I think we can do more on the gender, because on the aspects that you said, at least on some of those, because a part of our data set is really a census in the formal sector by male and female. So we have a very long series of time series for the formal sector and for total employment divided by gender. So I think we could and will try to do more. When in the Brazil, in an Ecuador paper where we are not so exposed, so we are able to disentangle the effects of the crisis from that of the secular trends and be more tease out causal effects. There we don't see very strong differences between men and women. We just see that both men and women, when they are less skilled, they suffer more. But it can be particular to this case, and it's different from what you're saying of the secular trends being influencing these longer time trends, which I completely agree with. I also like a lot your point on the competition. So this is super important, because cleansing that Rafael also emphasized is based on competition effects. So if there is no such thing as competition effects, then we'll have a less of this positive cleansing. So I think that's a great point. We will try to do more on that. I took all your points. I took notes. This was a great discussion, Raquel. Thank you very much. To Rafael, the same. So I think that's the puzzle. Is true. Is that such a temporary shock can have effects that are so persistent, that are so typical of a trade liberalization, of a technological change. And I think diving more into that is super important, and that's what we are trying. So now our point is more how come, and the how come answer comes from the way firms adjust. So because they change the composition, how they produce, that's why, and this is not something that you go back to where we were before. That's why we have this such persistent effects. So I think that's the key point, and we should kind of emphasize it more. And the second key aspect is really what you were saying of the cleansing effects and how these adjustments across firms happens, who exits, who doesn't, because that can also lead to these longer term effects. And that's a super well taken point. We do have data on training. We did not look at it for this paper, but So we have the records of unemployment insurance and employment benefits at individual level and Bolsa Família at individual level. The income replacement of these programs for these workers is about 6%, so very low. For unemployment insurance, it's 4.7, so it's really on the low side. And persistence you see only on Bolsa Família, so there you see effects for many, many years. We didn't look at training, so maybe we should. That's an excellent suggestion. So I'll take your point, and also on the general equilibrium effect of training, which will be for another paper. But I take your point, and I think that's the puzzle. And these were kind of my very rough responses. But you know, I really like everything. I took notes, and I will do.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you for this excellent presentation of the report. I'm personally very happy to see this launch, and because I know how many months went into its production, and how carefully you structured the research process for producing this report. And I'd like to thank the discussants for their excellent comments, and everyone who attended this session. It's being recorded, so I'm assuming that it will be on the website available for others to see it. It's very timely, and with this, I'm going to close now and say goodbye to everyone, and have a nice rest of the conference.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.